Well, the question is not, do you have expectations on your spouse? That's not the question, because I want to say and propose that all of us, all of you, myself included, we all have expectations in our relationships, in all of our relationships, not just our relationship with our spouse, but in all of our relationships. I would say this so strongly. I think that you have way more expectations on your spouse than you think you do. I would say you have a multitude of expectations on your spouse, whether you realize it or not. Whether you're aware of it or you're not aware of it, you have things in your life, in your relationship, that you just expect your spouse to do, to be, to act, to say. There's a lot, okay? I want you to believe me, so I'm going to ask you some questions, okay? Here we go. Do you expect your spouse to live in the same house as you and sleep in the same bed as you? Yeah, you do. That's kind of important, I think, if you're married. How about this one? Do you expect there to be some share of the responsibilities in terms of the household care? Yeah, you do. The women especially just said, yeah, even though they didn't say it with their voices, they said it with their eyes. Do you expect your spouse not to have a romantic relationship with anybody else other than you? Yes. Yes, that is an expectation that we have. Okay. Do you expect to share some of the parenting responsibilities in the home? Of course you do. That would be absurd not to. Wives, this one's specifically for you. After your husband uses the toilet, what do you expect him to do? I heard fourth, there was like 5 or 6 things. I was going for put the toilet seat down, but I heard someone say flush. Husbands, it's much more difficult to find one that's universally applicable to the husbands. This is the only one I could think of. There's something wrong with me. Let me just say it, and then we'll just be okay with it. Okay. In the first year of your marriage, how much did you expect to have sex? Right? In the first year of your marriage, I'll just give you the answer. The answer is a lot. We all had the same expectation in the first few years of our marriage that would be the case. It doesn't matter what the issue is, what the thing you're talking about is, everybody has some expectations. I think that all those expectations that I gave you are reasonable expectations for the most part. They are reasonable, they make sense, they are generally good, they're not debated on a lot. We can agree with those things, but there are other things that I would say are unreasonable expectations, and that's what I want to talk about today to frame our thinking of the importance of the fact that we all have expectations on our spouses. So let's make sure that we're thinking about this rightly. Let me give you, just to lay out some that I just found on the internet as I was perusing expectations, realistic, unrealistic, just what people say might be unrealistic expectations in a marriage. Here's a few for you. Here's one. My spouse will take care of my every need. If you think that your spouse exists to take care of your every need, that everything that you have a need for, your spouse would be the sole person to provide it for you, think that's an unrealistic expectation. There's lots of reasons why this might not take place, why it can't take place. You can't just assume that this is always going to be the case. If you do, you probably have an unrealistic expectation on your spouse. Oh, everything that I need, if I have an issue, if I have a problem, my spouse, they're going to solve it. They're going to be the fix in every situation. It's not right. It's not reasonable. How about my spouse will always be the source of my happiness? I mean, they'll always be at the center of it. If I'm happy, it's because my spouse is going to be there. That's the whole point of this, is I'm married to be happy, and so my spouse is the source of my happiness always, all the time. That's how it works. Well, we know that that's not true. Sometimes your spouse is the source of your pain or your consternation or your frustration. And so if you go into this saying, oh, it's all about the happiness, and if we embark off this path and I'm no longer happy because of my spouse, well, then we have a problem. That's your expectation. How about this one? I should always be at the center of attention for my spouse. I mean, my spouse should care about me and me only and nothing else, and it doesn't matter what's going on. It's about me. People maybe not here in this room, but in this world, have these expectations. This one in particular is a big one that has to be addressed within the culture because people are so selfish in their orientation. They think getting married is all about just having someone take care of their needs and putting all the attention on them. If that's the expectation you go in, your marriage is going to have problems. It's unrealistic. It's unreasonable. What about this? My spouse will want to spend all the time with me. Now, if you're my wife, this is fine because I just want to be with you, as I sang to you a few months back. But your spouse doesn't necessarily always want to be with you. They might need some alone time. They might have to get other things done. They might have other responsibilities, other relationships, other people that they need to engage with. They might not want to be with you every waking second of every day, my wife excluded. She's not here right now. She wants to be here. She wants to be here. This is one that people get messed up all the time, right? My spouse's interests, what they want to do, their hobbies, their dreams, their desires, they're going to always be in alignment with mine. That person, when we get together and we both love kayaking out on the ocean together, that's always going to be the same. And we have this dream of becoming billionaires and living on Fiji. That's always going to be the dream for both of us. It's never going to change. We're going to be in alignment. Now, people change. This changes. You might have different ideas, different desires, different dreams, different interests that grow over time. It's unrealistic. It's not how it works. Right? How about this one? My husband should look like Thor from the Marvel movies. Unrealistic, ladies. It's not going to happen. I saw someone raise the roof over there. That's the expectation. You're right. You got the tubby one. I'm sorry, I'm not up to speed as much. Okay. All right. That might be an expectation that you have. Now, this one I actually use in premarital counseling to make it absurd, but it goes back to a bygone era. But I tell the guys, I say, you should not expect every day when you come home from work for your wife to be vacuuming in high heels with a nice little revealing dress on, right? It's kind of what it used to be like to some degree with what people thought culturally marriage looked like. All of these things you can see, you can pinpoint, there's problems in these. There's some unrealistic things going on here. And I think these are cultural things that we adopt at times and we see in other marriages. And maybe you can identify little pieces of this in your life, but mainly you're thinking, we're Christians and we think differently and we're trying to be separate from the world, but so this isn't me, right? And I guess I would say the problem with all of this is that we don't evaluate our expectations enough. And the real truth of it is you have expectations on every aspect of your relationship. So these might seem extreme, but let me just list a few things for you just to think about, right? You have expectations on your spouse, whether good or bad, right or wrong, biblical or unbiblical, on how you communicate, what that should look like, on how you order your home and discipline your children, on how much time you spend together, what that time looks like, how you protect that time, what you do when you have that time. You have expectations there. Right? You have expectations on how your physical affection works when you're at public, when you're at home, what's too much, what's not enough, right? You have expectations. You have expectations on how you follow through with commitments and how you make promises to one another and what you do with your finances and what you're going to do at church and how often you're going to go. And everything is an expectation. In your parenting, in your spiritual maturity, the direction of the toilet paper, it doesn't matter what it is. There is an expectation that you have on your spouse in almost every area of their life. Everything, whether you realize it or not, okay? So here's the crux of this that I need you to hear from me right here. What happens, this is what happens all the time in marriage, what happens because you do have expectations on your spouse, what happens if those expectations in some of those areas, a good amount of those areas, all those areas, between you and your spouse are not met? What happens if you've got all these expectations and those expectations are not met? What if your spouse is not meeting your expectations? Well, typically what this looks like Just from a general sense, and anybody will tell you this. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to open the pages of the Bible to get this as a general truth of how God has made things. If you have unmet expectations in your relationship, you're generally unhappy in your relationship. Most divorce lawyers would say, here's a good marker and evidence to say your marriage is going in the wrong direction. You are unhappy. You probably got all these expectations and they're not being met. You're unhappy. You're disappointed. You're unsatisfied. Maybe you grow frustrated. You become sad, maybe bitter towards your spouse. You become resentful because they're not meeting your expectations. You become angry, you get into fights, you withdraw, you start to look for your expectations to be met by other people. You want more than what they're giving you. You want different than who they are and what they're providing for you, or you want out. Because you have set in your mind a series of things that you expect your spouse to be and do, and you know what? They're not meeting that. And so, in one way, shape, or form, you're done. You're done. A marriage that is centered on unmet expectations, that is really founded on unrealistic, bad, unreasonable expectations, is really doomed to fail in some sense. Whether in the immediate or in the long term, it's on track for destruction. So what are you to do given the reality that, yeah, of course, we're all going to have expectations. We have lots of expectations. Sometimes our spouse doesn't meet our expectation. Well, how do we deal with this? Well, I think the basic logical response that a lot of people have is, well, I'm just going to stop having expectations. And if your mind goes there at all, if you're going to say, I know what to do, I'm going to get rid of my expectations for my spouse, I'll just tell you right now, good luck. It's not going to work. You cannot just by the effort of your own will decide, I'm going to just have no expectations on any of my relationships. It doesn't work that way. You're going to develop them. You're going to have them. You're not going to succeed. So that's not the solution to this problem. You might just be thinking, okay, what I can do is maybe my expectations are too high and I just need to bring them down a little bit, right? Lower your expectations. That's what we tell people that don't look so great when they're trying to get the really nice looking person, right? Lower your expectations, right? Bring them down. Right? And so you might be saying, okay, you know what? I do want a 5-course meal every day when I come home for dinner, and that's fine if I can just go to 3. That's okay. But that's not really the issue at hand, is it? It's not, are your expectations too high? It's, are your expectations right? So the question is not, do you have expectations on your spouse? The answer to that is yes, you do. The question is, are your expectations on your spouse biblically ordered? Are they good? And are they reasonable? Or, in contrast to that, are your expectations on your spouse, are they based on something else other than the Bible? Are they bad, generally speaking, for you and your marriage? And are they unreasonable? That's the kind of evaluation that we need to do to be able to say, okay, I have expectations, what do I do with them? Let's evaluate them and let's use the right lens to evaluate it. Now, I cannot tell you, sit here tonight and give you an exhaustive list of all the expectations that are wrong and unreasonable. That would be an insurmountable task that we can never get done. But what I can do is, biblically speaking, I can give you some examples of how we form some bad, unreasonable expectations, and then give you a better framework to evaluate expectations. So that's what I want to do. So underneath our first point here about unrealistic expectations, I want you to think about how some of these expectations that are unrealistic, bad, and unbiblical, where they come from in order to bolster yourself, defend yourself against where these things come from. And then do the opposite of these. So the first one is this. Well, where do they come from? Unrealistic expectations are influenced by culture. Okay? We develop in our relationships unrealistic expectations because of the culture. We are all in a culture. We all feed in a culture. We consume media and information. We have relationships inside of the culture. We see other marriages inside of the culture. We are all influenced by the culture. And oftentimes, your bad expectations, your unreasonable expectations, comes from you being someone who is unintentionally or uh, without a strong enough defense against the cultural influence on your marriage. I mean, just think about the way marriages are portrayed in any TV show sitcom. Think about how marriages are portrayed in most of media, what it looks like. It is abhorrent, it is wrong, it is unbiblical, and yet we see it, and there's just a piece of us that says, you know what, I kind of wish my spouse would do this, be like that, because we're just influenced by it. We're influenced by it all the time. And the Bible is clear to us that we need to be bolstered against this, to have our defenses up against this, because this is the way of the world against Christians, is to come after us in this way. So in Colossians it says, see to it that no one takes you captive. That's really the idea of what's happening. The world is trying to ensnare you, to enslave you to its way of thinking by its own philosophy, this worldly philosophy that is empty, it has no purpose, it adds no value. The world is out there saying, have this kind of relationship and you'll be happy, when in reality, everyone's miserable, it's empty, and it's deceitful. And it's not good. And yet we buy into it for some reason. We say, man, if we could just have that, that would be great. And then it gives more clarity and says, according to what? According to what people think. Human tradition. The laws and rules and statutes of man. What is it according to? Well, it's not according to Christ. It's according to the elemental spirits of the world. It's according to Satan and his demons, the adversary who is seeking to destroy you. That's the worldly system, and that worldly system is very much in effect in your marriages, in the culture, as it is trying to come in and seep in and ensnare you and take you captive, and it's all according to what people think is best, but it's really ultimately a scheme of the devil to take you away from what is good, what is God ordained, what God says, this is an institution that I made for you, for your flourishing and for my glory, and they're going to try to take all of that away. And we are influenced by all of the things that the world says, your wife should look like this, your husband should act like this, your wife should cook like this. Whatever it would be, there is so many people out there just saying this is what it looks like, and we have to rightly address it and say, you know what? I'm not going to be influenced by the culture. I refuse. I'm going to be immune to the culture, not influenced by the culture. I'm going to be immune to the culture. When I see stuff, I've got my walls up so high that nothing's coming over. I know that this is not right, and I'm not going to let it cross this boundary. And we do this just in a general sense when we scroll through social media, when we're just watching TV mindlessly, but we also do it just by the company that we keep, and we know that as we engage with people in the world, there are people that are oftentimes trying to convince you that their way is right. That what they think is best is what you think is best. I mean, I heard just the other day that there was a group locally, where a whole neighborhood, where there was a group of swingers in a neighborhood, in a cul-de-sac, where all the neighbors were hooking up with each other, and they were all married. And they were trying to go around to each and every neighbor and just convince the other neighbors that that was the right thing to do. You know what the expectation is? That you are free sexually in your relationship to have sex with other couples. I mean, that's an extreme example, but this is what goes on in the workplaces. This is what happens in schools. This is what happens all the time. The redefining of expectations of how you should think about your marriage. And we know that if we align ourselves in too close of a relationship with people who hold these things, we are going to be corrupted. Right? We're gonna have our defenses, our standards eroded as they continue to breach the wall. We need to be careful not to be influenced, but to be immune. We need to be immune to culture. So unrealistic expectations, they come from the culture. but they're also really ultimately created by something that you're doing in your own mind, which we all know of, and it's so biblically clear to us, but it needs to be stated. It's that they are created not by the culture. Well, they can influence you, but then they're created by you now comparing your spouse to that picture that they present to you. Your spouse compared to your neighbor's spouse, compared to your coworker's spouse. All of a sudden, you start to do what the Bible says you should not do, is that you start to compare and contrast and desire, and using the biblical word covet. You begin to want that aspect of them. You want something about their relationship, something about the way they engage with each other, and then you begin to layer that on top of your relationship. You say, that I like how they do that. I want that. To which the Bible is very clear and explicitly clear on this point. Even within in the Ten Commandments, to identify this so clearly, you have to think about how big this is. I mean, do not murder, do not steal, do not take the Lord's name in vain. And then it's like, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Why did it have to be so explicitly stated? Why can't it just be like, don't covet, coveting's bad? It's like, don't covet, and then here's some things that you should think about. Don't covet your neighbor's house. Don't covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant. Don't covet at all, but there's something identified here is it's really bad for you to not be content with the person that God has given you to be your spouse. There's something inherently morally wrong with comparing other people to your relationship. And oftentimes you put it in a big general sense and you just say, well, I don't want to be married to that person. It's not necessarily you want to be married to that person. It's the qualities or the way they operate or the way they communicate. It's something about them. Something about their relationship intrigues you and you want it. And so now you have an expectation that you're going to covet it. I want that in their relationship. Now I'm going to put it over my relationship, and I'm going to compare my relationship and set an expectation that our relationship looks like theirs. And as soon as you're doing that, you're falling prey to the sin of the heart. And it has disastrous effects in our own relationships, as Proverbs says, right? If you want a peaceful, tranquil, quiet life, right? You want a heart that's at peace and that's not constantly riled up, gives life to you, makes you feel like you're enjoying yourself, well, you're not going to get that if you envy. You're not going to get that if you covet other people. If as you're looking at other people, you want what they want. What that's going to do is it's going to cause your bones to rot. And I'll just say, if you envy aspects of other people's marriages that God has not given you in your marriage, it's likely that your marriage is going to have some sort of rot in it. Because you're setting up a level of expectation based off of a desire to have something that God has not given you. Now, as a caveat, there are good things that you should desire. There are good things that you should desire. But to do it in a way where your first approach is to examine everyone around you, identify, and then set that expectation on your spouse is not the way to do it. That's the wrong way to do it. So if you have unrealistic expectations formed in your marriage, you're probably going to be influenced by the culture to some degree. Then you're going to be looking at people you work with or things you're seeing in the culture, and you're going to then create this comparison, this coveting comparison. But ultimately, the true heart of what is going on with unrealistic expectations, bad, unbiblical expectations, is super simple, and we all know it, but it's real. And all of us struggle with this, all of us. None of you can escape this room and say, I don't do this. We all do this. We are all motivated to set expectations on our spouse because of our own selfishness. What we do is we say, I want my spouse to do this for me. I want them to look like this for me. I want them to respond like this for me. It's all about me. It's out of a desire to see yourself elevated, pleased, happy, or motivated by selfishness. That is the mantra of the culture. Everything that I listed earlier that was an unrealistic expectation has this at the root, and the Bible identifies it so clearly in saying this is the problem for all of us. This is the problem, that we have desires, and those desires aren't met, and we are selfish. We want to obtain those desires, and so we go about doing things to satisfy our desires. That's how it's phrased in James. These two things are linked, the envy and the selfishness. If you have bitter jealousy, you want something that God has not provided for you and your spouse, and you have selfish ambition. You want it because it will be better for you. You're tired of fighting. You're tired of not getting your needs met. You're tired of not wanting or getting what you want. You're tired. And so you have selfish ambition. You want to go after it. And it's residing in your hearts. It says then, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but it's earthly. This is the way the world thinks. This is ungodly. This is satanic, right? It's unspiritual. It's demonic. This is not how Christians ought to think. Christians do not walk around identifying things that they want and saying, I want that, now I'm going to seek that out because it would please me, and go about making that the mantra of your life. That is wisdom that is demonic, as it says. And then it says, for where jealousy, right, that's that coveting, desire to have something that God has not given you, and selfish ambition exist to please yourself, there will be disorder and every vile practice. If you want your marriage to get all out of whack and for there to be fighting and conflict in your home, practice this by all means. Go after your own desires. Seek what makes you happy. Identify the things in other people that you want and go after it. Your marriage is going to be disordered, and then you're going to start to participate in things that are wrong, as it says in a later section in James. The problem here is that you have a covetous, bad, wrong desire for something. So what do? Now you act in. You do a vile practice. You murder, as it says. You covet, and you cannot get it. You can't receive it because you have no power to do it. God's the one that's going to supply this. You have no power to do it. You can't obtain, so you fight and you quarrel to try to get it. This is happening in marriages all the time. I want you to be like this, and you're not, and so I'm going to keep fighting with you and nagging you and bickering with you and telling you how you're disappointing me until you get to that place. So you fight and quarrel. And then it says very clearly, you do not have because you do not ask. You don't realize that you're not the source of this. God is the source of this. And then it's more clarifying. When you do ask, you don't receive. Even if you do ask, you're asking wrong because you asked to spend it on your own passions. You're acting out of selfish ambition to please yourself. And many of us, this is how we operate in our marriage. We say, you know what? If my wife, if my husband could just be like this, I would be happy. It would make my life more comfortable. It sure would ease a lot of my strain, my tension, my stress. If they could just get to this point, I want it so bad. I've seen it in other people. If they could just be like that. All of a sudden, you've elevated something that really is probably sinful for you because of the way you're going about doing this. Again, there are good things that you should desire. Good things that you should desire. But the way in which we go about this is not just looking around and saying, man, if I could have that. And then getting to the point in your own heart where you're coveting it, where you have to have it. You have to have it, and now you're going to go after it. And the reason why you have to have it is because you want it. I mean, that's what these passages are saying. There is a lot of reasons for why we have unrealistic expectations, but I think these three can help us identify them. Three things that will help us identify. Now, every week I've been making during the series questions for you to do as an individual and couples, and I admit I know they're challenging to some degree. Not all of you are doing them. I understand that. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, and I'm trying not to cause fights in your home. But this week, I'm not saying but this week I want you to fight in your home. This week I would like for you to do those individual questions. Even if you've not done the couple questions, you've not done this before, make an effort to do this, because what I'm asking you to do is I'm asking you to evaluate some of your expectations based off of this framework. I want you to just make a list, and I'm totally okay with you taking that list when you're done with this evaluation process and burning it, right? You don't need to let your spouse see this, right? I'm not asking you to do that. You don't need to do that. Make a list of things that you expect. And this might take some time and some reflection, and maybe it would be wise of you to have an ongoing list. Maybe you do something on your phone. Maybe you keep a little journal somewhere and you just write some things down. But use this as a framework and say, you know what? Is this expectation that I have on my spouse, is this something that's really something that I want or expect because the culture has told me? Is this something that I expect because I've seen it in other people and I just desire it? Is this something that I expect of my spouse because it would make me happier? It would solve one of my problems? I just think it's wise of us to evaluate our expectations by this type of framework. And so I would ask for you to do that. If you do that this week, then I want to take you to this next section of what we want to talk about, which is not just, are my expectations, developed by the culture and driven by comparison and motivated by selfishness, but now how should I rightly view my expectations? So, realistic expectations, biblical, godly, good expectations take a few things into account. And I'm going to fly through these and I'll just make a few comments, but there are some things that you absolutely as a Christian should take into account. Those other things I want you to evaluate and then say, okay, now are my expectations thinking through these realities? Right? Do you recognize the fact that God is sovereign in your relationship? Because when we covet and we look and we compare and we evaluate according to other people, we often forget that God has decided in his sovereign plan through his providence and working his plan out in the world for your specific relationship that you would be married to your husband or your wife. We sometimes forget and we say, God maybe made a mistake. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't know how horrible this person was. Maybe he didn't know that we wouldn't get together. Right? Well, what do we think here is going on? God knows and has made a plan for you. And you're walking in this plan now. And you cannot neglect the sovereignty of God equation in your marriage. I love this passage in Daniel. This is a weird section because it's actually Nebuchadnezzar here who is saying something true and biblical, this ungodly guy, but he's saying this, and he is just clarifying who God is, and he says he does everything according to his will. Among who? Well, the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. It's a way of saying amongst everybody. There's no one that can get away from the exercise of his will. But I love the phrase that he uses at the end. He says, and none can stay his hand. You can't stop him from exercising his will. He's going to do it. Or say to him, what have you done? And oftentimes what we do as Christians is we say, you know what? God, what have you done? Why have you given me a person that has this proclivity or this attribute when you knew I really needed this? And are you sitting there wagging your finger at God and saying, what have you done? What have you done? How dare you put me with this person? There is a trust that we need to have in the sovereignty of God in our own relationships. Maybe it's not going great. Maybe there's problems. Maybe it's fantastic. But in all of that, we need to be able to say, God, you are in control. And who am I to question your divine plan? Your will be done. Who am I to ask? This will help frame your expectations when you start to set expectations on your spouse. To be able to say, you know what? God knows who my spouse is. He planned this from the beginning. He is in control. He has ordained this trial. He has ordained this blessing. He has ordained our family. He has ordained this. And so because of that, there's a trust that you can develop in him. And it helps reshape biblically your expectations. You should also take into account something that the Bible is very clear on, that every person is unique and an individual. The challenge that we have is we look around and we have this cookie cutter of what we envision the ideal person is. And we set our expectations based off that ideal person, and we forget that God has made every single person unique as an individual. I mean, we know that he knit us in our mother's womb. Each piece formed us. He knows the hairs of our head. He identifies us uniquely. He knows our names individually. There's something distinct about each and every one of us. And there is no such thing as this cookie cutter husband or wife that some person is putting on Instagram, right? It just doesn't exist. And so your spouse is unique, and we need to remember that this is how it works. God has gifted each and every person to do different things, to be better at some things than others, to respond differently than other people. That is the way that God has designed us, that each one of us is given a specific gift to use within the church, but God has designed each and every one of us in our personality to how we relate to one another in our relationships as well. This is part of the blessing of diversity that God has in the midst of his people and the whole of creation, that we're all unique. And each and every person not only has varied gifts and uses, but God has assigned for each and every person work that they are to do given those proclivities, given their varied gifts. And so when you are thinking about your spouse, you're often thinking about the things that they lack instead of the things that God has uniquely gifted them to do. And so one of the things that I think you should do on a regular basis, not just this week, but you should recount in your own mind, what are the things that my spouse is and how they respond and their personality that God has given them that's unique? What are their strengths? What are their gifts? What are their talents? What is it that they do that no one else can do? Because we like to compare to other people and say, what is it that they can do that my spouse can't do? But I want to flip the script on this and say, no, you need to be focused on what it is that your wife, your husband is so good at. That God just uniquely gifted them, and you know what? He has sovereignly placed you with them for a reason, and you should be grateful for that, those aspects of their life. The third one is one that is probably the most important to me. We've got to all realize, we got to realize the reality of sin. If you, at any point in time, just think that your spouse can meet your expectations perfectly, or they're not going to stumble, or they're not going to falter in any way, you're just forgetting. Sometimes we just need a reminder. We all stumble in many ways. There's no one righteous, no, not one, right? Your spouse is not perfect. They're never going to be perfect. You are not perfect. You're never going to be perfect. It says in Ecclesiastes, not a righteous man on the earth who does good and never sins. It doesn't exist. There is not one of you in this room that could do this right. And so the principle that underlies this is, as we recall that, we need to be very careful how we approach our relationships with other people. And we look at passages like this and say, oh yeah, I need to remember that if I see something in my spouse that they're doing or not doing, that we don't just jump down their throats and attack them and say, you know what, you're not meeting my expectations. You're not doing what's right. You're not doing what's best. You're not doing what's good. You're not doing what's biblical, because you got to realize that you yourself too are a sinner. And you have your own problems and your own failures and your own things. This levels the playing field for husband and wife. When we rightly view the problem of sin as it relates to our marriages, then all of a sudden we start to think differently about our spouses. And we start saying, you know what? Given the fact that my wife is a sinner and I'm a sinner, we're doing pretty good. Like, we're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to honor God with our relationship. And you know what? We've made progress and things are going in the right direction. Praise God that He has given us the ability to do that. The reality of sin should affect all of us as we think through our marriages and say, you know what? I can't have expectations on my spouse that doesn't take into account the reality that not only are they a sinner and they're going to fall short of the glory of God in many ways, but so am I. And that affects how we relate to one another and set expectations on one another. And finally, the one thing that we have to use as a caveat here, because I've said a few things that might make you think what I'm saying is your spouse shouldn't ever try to change. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that if you have a spouse and they're doing all these things that you deem horrible and they don't align with the scripture and all these things, right, that you should just ignore those things. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that we need to rightly think about our expectations. But this last point I think helps us. We need to remember that if we call Christ our Lord, we have the Spirit of God, okay? We all have the ability to continue to grow, to be the people that our spouse needs, that God has designed us to be for them. Not to match an image of someone else out there, not to conform to a picture that the culture sets or that a neighbor sets, but to be the person that God has ordained us to be for our spouse. To think about your unique gifts and that God has put you together and the reality that you're both sinners, and say, you know what? By the power of God, through the empowerment of His Spirit, I am able to grow into this person. And all of us should have a sense of confidence in that yes, with God's empowerment, we can be better. Never perfect, but better. And we will actually meet our spouse's needs that God has ordained for us. Not the ones that our spouse wrongly sets, but the real things that God really cares about, if we can rely on the Spirit of God. And we know that these things are in opposition, as it says in Galatians 5. We are to walk by the Spirit, not gratify the desires of the flesh. These are opposed to the Spirit. We as Christians have the ability to cast off the shackles of what the world is saying about have these expectations and say, you know what? No. I am going to, by the empowerment of God, strive to be the husband God has made me to be, strive to be the woman of God, the wife that God has made me to be for my husband or for my wife. I decided recently that I was going to teach my daughter how to play chess. Told anybody that? You guys know that? I was like, okay, I want my kids to learn how to play chess. I played chess when I was young. I think it's good for your brain. Let's play some chess. It'll be fun to play chess. So I taught both my daughters. One, by the uniqueness of my child, had no interest whatsoever and never wants to see a chessboard again. And the other one is into it. And so there was a period of time where my oldest daughter and I, we were just playing chess constantly. And I always expected to beat my daughter because I was teaching her how to play chess, right? I mean, I whooped her. I mean, it was bad. Every game, every time, I'm playing easy, I'm taking her down. That was my expectation. Okay? And I beat her for every game for a few months. Like, we were solid. It was like 4-6 months in. She never won. It became this thing. When are you going to beat Dad? One day. Maybe one day you'll beat Dad. I don't know. You might beat Dad. And I don't know what happened, but one day she just beat me, just the first game. And it was I think I got her a cake or something. I was like, you beat me. Congratulations, you beat me. But then we went back to me whooping her again. So, I got to make it challenging for her, right? I didn't just let her win. She needs to earn this. But then something shifted just recently where it wasn't just a fluke game where I made a mistake. It was like, I'm trying as hard as I can, and I lost. And then I'm like, okay, maybe I did something I didn't realize I did something wrong. Let's have a rematch. And then I lost again. And I'm thinking, something's wrong. I must be tired. Let's go to bed. I'm going to wake up in the morning. When I'm fresh, I'm going to play you. And then I lost. And I'm thinking, man, something has changed. Something has changed. My daughter is all of a sudden beating me. Now, if my expectation was I'm always going to win against my daughter, I'm just always going to win, that's my goal, well, I think that's unrealistic because that's not my goal. And our goals, our expectations of how things work should shift over time. The whole reason why I wanted to teach my daughters how to play chess is it gives us something to do together. It strengthens our relationship. It's good for development, not only for her, but for us. It's not for my benefit to be the one that wins all the time. It's for her benefit. It's so that she can have something that she does with her dad. It's so that she can grow and develop in her brain and get good at it. And I am happy that she is beating me, and I'm all about it and not just making me work harder so I can keep up. My goal and my desire influences my expectations. I mean, it does. My goal is not just to beat her. It's to have a relationship with my daughter, to strengthen that relationship, to develop that relationship. Your expectations should have at their heart, at the goal, at the center of this, not to be about getting what you want, fulfilling your desires. It should be all about having a relationship. Everything that I think is going to happen in our relationship, I'm thinking about your good, what's best for you, and how we can do this together. All of us have to strive to fight for that, because when you're in the midst of it, it's really fun to win. It's really fun to get the thing you want. It's really fun to compete against the other person, but the goal has got to be in place. You know what? I want to honor God. I want to do what's right. I want to build this relationship, and I want to see you pushed forward. It's not about me. It's about you. Let's have those things be the things that motivate our expectations. So as you go to your groups tonight, as you go through these questions together, I pray that you really would think deeply about your own expectations, evaluate it by these lenses, and let's do better at this and please God with our relationships. Let's pray. God, as I often pray, God, we do need your help because we do stumble in many ways. And our goal here is not to be downers or to beat on ourselves, God, but to please you, to live holy and righteous lives in accord with your word. And so, God, I do ask that you would cause us to be people who use your word to evaluate ourselves and our actions in every regard. In this particular area, God, we ask that you would help us to not have expectations that are unbiblical, that are bad for our marriages, or that are unreasonable, but that are in alignment with your word, that are good for our marriages, and that are very reasonable to obtain because you've given us your spirit. So, God, we just ask that you would help us to have that type of realignment start tonight, that those of us who have in this room issues, for those that are sitting here that have unmet expectations, that this would be a reset in their lives. And God, we just ask that you would help us to be people that honor you in every aspect of our lives, including our relationships with our spouses. So God, give us the strength that you alone can provide, and help us to be the people that you have called us to be through the power of your Spirit. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.